Greetings and welcome back to Apisecure. Next up, we'll have Topher Marie, who is a CTO and co-founder of Strata, and we will be going over modernizing legacy APIs. Welcome, Topher.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really appreciate being here today. So let's get into this. Thanks everyone for joining. What I want to talk about is, for flexibility's sake, modernize your legacy APIs. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, modernization. So what I want to cover is really what does modernization mean, and what do we mean by the legacy APIs in the first place? So who am I? I am CTO and co-founder of a company called Strata Identity. I was, prior to this, the lead identity architect at Oracle. I have been a product owner at Auth0. I also co-founded a company called JumpCloud, which is a little more in the directory as a service space. And I was also an engineer at Ping Identity and Simplified. So a lot of identity focus in my background. But one of the things that I've really gotten into, something that's very interesting to me, is working with large established systems in giant enterprises, or sometimes people call these legacy systems. But let me get a little bit into what do I mean by legacy. So a lot of attention gets spent on best practices, paradigms, and the things that we want to do for new development. And that's great. And it's probably the topic of a lot of what's been going on in this conference. But in my life, we talk about legacy systems quite a bit. For me, a legacy system is any software that's currently and actively being used by its intended audience. That's not necessarily to say that there's not some new development associated with it, some maintenance. Really, probably all software has some continuous maintenance associated with it. And active versus maintenance, active development versus maintenance, that's a kind of a spectrum. But I think the core to this is that legacy software is currently and actively being used by its intended audience. Get into that in just a second, why that's kind of important. But I also want to point out that it can be from many different sources. One thing that I tend to think about when I hear legacy software is these big enterprise platforms, things like CA SiteMinder or one of the big Oracle Suite products. And that's a great example of it. But we also need to be considering other sources of this software, things like just custom off-the-shelf software. I would say that if you're running Microsoft Access in some form currently in your company, that's a pretty good indication that you've got legacy software. Or it's bespoke things that are created in-house or created by a team of consultants. Also could be legacy software, so long as it's currently being used by its intended audience. And legacy software is important too. We need to keep this in perspective when we talk about what is it that my company does, or a person's company does. A lot of effort is actually on the existing software. A lot of care must be spent with this existing software. We can't just write it and be done with it. People still need to do some enhancements, still need to do some maintenance to it. But the business use case, the software is still in use because the business use case is being fulfilled. We do find, obviously, that the underlying software may begin to age out, though. Over time, vulnerabilities accrue. Security is always advancing. The best practices are getting better and better around security, around identity, which is obviously something important to me. And maybe just the paradigms have changed. We see this a lot with APIs, where over time we go from just using RESTful services to RPCs to more and more advanced ways of and best practices of interacting with APIs. So this is something that we need to keep in mind, and why we may want to move into modernization. So talked about what I mean by legacy software. Now let me talk about what I mean by modernization. So modernization isn't about changing the business functionality. Sure, again, we may be doing some enhancements to this software, but modernization isn't primarily about making changes to the software and its business use cases. Instead, it could be things like security and access control fixes. Again, the security marches on. We have better and better practices. We have more and more vulnerabilities that are being found in the market by people who are trying to exploit this. Moving to the, like I said before, the latest APIs and frameworks and behaviors. Enhanced usability is often a side effect of modernization, but it is not the primary thing that we're trying to do when we talk about modernization. Some typical trigger scenarios for this. When we talk about doing modernization, it's kind of a tough sell because, well, it's going to cost money. And in the best case, you still have a system that works, but you're going and you're making changes to it. So there are some typical trigger scenarios which will push managers and product owners over the line and get them to say, yep, it's time to modernize this system. One of those, very common one actually, is that the legacy system reaches an end of life. This doesn't really apply so much to bespoke systems, things that you have written for your particular company. But instead, like if we're talking about commercial off-the-shelf software, or if we're talking about these large platforms, sometimes they reach end of life and they're no longer going to be supported. One thing that I've seen a lot of recently is a price increase on these legacy platforms. Things like CA SiteMinder or even some of the SaaS products have huge price increases that are being given to the enterprises that are using this software. And they may have been on the fence already, but when the price doubles or triples, that's a pretty good indication that maybe now is a good time to invest in modernizing the software. Some other triggers we've seen: centralizing responsibility for security and access management into a single team. Often we see, hey, here's a whole bunch of applications with a whole bunch of different app owners. Now, because that responsibility is kind of being spread around a whole bunch of different people, the better practice for that is to have one team in charge of the security or the access control. So centralizing responsibility sometimes triggers modernization. And adding security to an existing app via second factor authentication. That's come up quite a bit recently, where there's been a government mandate that we need to have MFA with software that's being used by government employees. Another one, improving overall security posture, moving to zero trust. And one that's near and dear to my heart is also difficult to maintain because of talent availability. Sometimes the world has moved on and there's not as many people who are working in this antiquated software anymore, or even these antiquated languages. So it's time to start thinking about doing modernization. So modernization, what are we trying to accomplish when we do so? We're talking about fixing some vulnerabilities, enhancing the security around it, taking advantage of popular and modern frameworks. That's another thing that we see quite a bit. Again, maybe moving from a antiquated language to a more modern language, but maybe just using more modern software. And don't undervalue the power of community. Sometimes it's just hard to hire in a certain framework, but if you change which framework you're using, there's a much better, more supportive community around it. And another goal of modernization is to follow the current best practices. Again, just very obviously, the world has moved on in software development over its entire history. So following the current best practices is often a great goal of modernization. All right. Now let's talk about, we've talked about what modernization is, what I mean by legacy software. Let's talk about some tactics, a couple of tactics for modernization. Not every modernization journey is the same. The default tactic for doing software modernization might be do a rewrite. This is definitely what engineers think about first. As an engineer, I can say that we're like architects, we're like builders. We see maybe a dilapidated shack on a piece of land and we want to just bulldoze that thing off and start fresh. A lot of professional services companies and consultants also think like this, and they would prefer to rewrite it rather than to work with the existing software. They have their own motivations for doing that. Product owners, app owners, managers, not so much. They don't love doing a rewrite, and for good reason. Well, part of that being that at the best, you get the same functionality that you had already and have thrown a whole bunch of labor into it. There's a lot of downsides to rewrites, like the budget that I just talked about. Rewriting the same software so it's behaving the same way with a little bit, maybe more security, maybe the protocol, the usability of it is improved somewhat. Time that it takes. We work with a lot of large enterprises, Fortune 50 companies, and it's not just budget, although they have their budget concerns as well, but also just the time that it's going to take. We work with one large company that has like 300 applications that fit our definition of legacy software. And they were saying, yeah, so with labor from our team, it's going to take between 3 to 6 months to modernize each of those. So we're talking decades for them to modernize all of this software. The complexity of the problem, obviously, the lack of expertise, like I said previously, that can be a big one where you've had this software, bespoke software in particular, that's been used on premises for a long period of time, and your team has moved on. In some cases, I've seen it where they've retired and they don't even have the source code for it anymore. So it's hard to go and get that expertise to rewrite some of the existing software. Risk of breakage, very obvious. If you're taking some well-established software and you're making changes to it, you better be sure you know what you're doing. And there's always risk to that. New development, existing development, replacing a legacy system. You got to make sure not only is your business use case still covered and you're not introducing new bugs or breaking things that should already be well established, but you have to be sure that you're doing things in a secure way too. Another one that I like to think about is, can you even stop developing in the existing code base? Assume that you have a important system and you're still doing maintenance on it. Can you just say, I'm going to swap over and we're going to rewrite this in this whole different paradigm? Or do you have to maintain it in two different places? It's a moving target. That's a very difficult project to undertake. And I'll just say that rewrite of Netscape back in, I don't actually know the approximate date, I would say early 2000s. That's what killed the company. They spent 3 years rewriting the product from scratch, and Microsoft ate their lunch during that period of time. So rewrites are not ideal. Another facet of that is what I call the rewrite treadmill. Because security is constantly evolving, because the best practices of software are constantly evolving, because the way users like to interact with your product may continue to change as you have competitors that do it in different ways, you get on the rewrite treadmill. You have to do it again and again. Once you establish, hey, this is the new version, it's almost instantaneously the next legacy version. Couple of examples of this using a lot of initials I've realized here. So OAuth best practices, like this is not an old thing. OAuth came out, it's been well established for the last decade, a little more. But even if you've already rewritten your software, took it off whatever paradigm it was using previously for security, for identity, and you moved it into OAuth, now OAuth itself is starting to be antiquated. And we talk about SSE for shared signals and events, or CAPE for continuous access evaluation. So that's just around the identity, but again, the paradigms may shift over time as well. So you had something that was perfectly fine as a RESTful interface for your APIs. It's moved to RPC. Now you have customers wanting to use GraphQL on it. Do you rewrite it again and again to provide the same business functionality over and over? That can be a problem. So instead, what I recommend is to use a facade. And I'll talk quite a bit about facades going on here in the next 10 minutes or so. So the facade basically is wrapping the existing software with the enhanced functionality. It does act as a proxy to the existing API. If we're talking more generally for applications, which I'm very interested in, legacy applications, it also can act as a proxy just to the application. And it's similar to the mediator pattern in some ways. What we care about here is that the API or the application itself has not changed. Pretend that it's a black box. I'm not going to change anything about it, but instead, at the facade level, I am going to enhance the behavior of what goes into the application. So I can enhance the security at that point, the access control. I can even change the API paradigm or make any improvements around that I need to. Here is a very trivial example of what I'm talking about, just kind of a visualization of it. I've got the legacy API, it's been out there forever. I need to change the behavior, so I want to take a bite at this by putting a proxy, a facade, between my user and the legacy API. Let's talk about some of the benefits of the facade. The API doesn't need to know that anything has changed. That's great because, again, rewriting or changing, cracking open those old legacy applications can be very bad news for all the reasons that we talked about just a few minutes ago. Another great thing about that is because I haven't changed the API, this rewrite, it always still works. I can always go around and the old functionality is always still available. And there's a lot less risk to the business logic, assuming we're just applying one of those things like security or access control or changing the API paradigm. That might be a little bit different there, but there's less risk to breaking the business logic of an existing application that has been crafted over a long time. Another thing I really like about the facade pattern is that it can be incrementally deployed and developed. I can do just a little bit here, a little bit there. I can do it for just one app at a time, even though I know I have dozens of APIs where I need to change the access control getting into the APIs. I can do it one at a time and a lot less risk than trying to do it all at once. Another thing that I really like about facades are that you remove, that you decouple the security, the access control, and even the API paradigm. You decouple them from the business logic. They're no longer built into the software itself. Now, why would we bother decoupling it? Because if we don't decouple here, we're basically rewriting the app again, and software and security are constantly evolving. We're getting back on that rewrite treadmill. Without the decoupling, we have a new legacy product on our hands immediately. We're already looking at, okay, so what's changed in identity? What's changed in security that now I will have to go and crack open this application again and rewrite it? By externalizing, by decoupling, by using a facade, that means that we're maintaining the flexibility for similar changes in the future if we need them. All right, so creating your facade. Again, this is pretty much the same diagram, horizontally instead of vertically. The thing that's important here is when we get started, let's first just get a bite at the traffic by routing the traffic through a proxy point. I personally like to use something like Golang to write a proxy, and I've got my hands into everything, and I can do whatever I need to with the traffic that's going through to the legacy API. But anything your team is comfortable with is fine. This could be Nginx, and you're using modules in order to rewrite the traffic that's going through. That could be the solution that you're looking for. What's important here is at this first step, what I would recommend is do nothing. Don't change the traffic as it goes through. Just send the raw traffic through to the API. This will give us a chance to iron out the networking. We can make sure that we can route the traffic appropriately to the API, and that we have a bite at everything that's going through. If we're changing, hey, I've rewritten things, and I've got a whole bunch of changes that are being made to the way that the API works and the traffic that's going into the legacy API, and also you're doing all of the networking at the same time, just too many moving parts. So I always say, first, just proxy the traffic and don't do anything to it. Once you are proxying that traffic, what I love to do is to prepare some traffic filtering. I like to get ready for the case in which I want some traffic to go through that upper route directly to the legacy API, like it's always gone, and some other traffic to go through the facade. This prepares me for, one, What if I break something? What if the facade changes the behavior in some way? Like people can't log in because I've written a defect to it. If I have this backup way of still going to the legacy API hasn't changed. This gives me a lot more security in being able to, a lot more confidence in being able to make changes. It also gives me the ability to start filtering traffic based on just like A/B testing. Give some traffic the old way, give some traffic through the facade. You could have multiple facades to go to multiple legacy APIs at this point as well. Now we can get to some of the interesting bits here. So this allows for that incremental approach. One of the things that I highly recommend you don't do is a big bang cutover. We want to be able to make these incremental changes via the facade, via the abstraction layer that we're putting in, and show immediate value. We can, that allows us to do small stories, small steps, test them with our target audience, test them and show them to the product owners, to the app owners, make sure that it still works the way that they are expecting, and be able to make these incremental changes as opposed to a big bang. As an aside, the big bang anti-pattern, this is something, well, so what do I mean by the big bang? I mean where you've got a 6-month project and you've gone and you've rewritten the application altogether. Or maybe you've put a facade on it, but you haven't put it out all at once. Instead, it happens on a weekend, Friday night, your entire development team has to stay there. All of your app owners have to be in there in order to test the applications. This is an anti-pattern, and it gives everyone a stomach ache. Something like 70% of software products or projects fail over time. Incremental approach, avoiding this big bang cutover by using the facade and being able to route traffic and choose which traffic goes through it significantly improves your life as a developer, as a product owner, all of those things. All right, so now we're really getting to the interesting parts. I've got this facade. I've got this bite at the traffic that's going to the legacy API. What can I do now? It's just going through. Well, so if needed, this is a good time to modernize the API protocols themselves. This is a good time to say, yeah, maybe you are changing from some ancient legacy thing that wasn't even RESTful and adding the capability to change the traffic to REST on what I call the upstream. The downstream being the user, people who are interacting with the software, going through the proxy, and then the upstream side of that is the destination application. So using this proxy, using your rewrite ability of the traffic that's going through to change the protocol. Maybe all you're doing is transforming from, a legacy kind of data structure, and you're just making it into JSON instead. You see that a flag is being added as the API request comes through, a new flag that you are willing to accept. You can have your proxy, you can have your facade do the transformation from the legacy format into JSON. All kinds of interesting things that we don't even really need to dig into at this point because we've got, I'm sure, so much expertise in this arena. So modernizing the protocol, decoupling the identity. This is not just specific to APIs. This is something that I live and breathe all the time with legacy applications, where a lot of legacy applications had like username and password built into them. A lot of APIs had, we've got a token that we accept, and that token is hard-coded or in a database. And so we will, as long as that exists this way, but just not the modern best practices. And also probably not a great responsibility for the application itself. Applications should concentrate on their business use cases and not on the externals like, well, access control. So decoupling these things, I love the word decouple. So decoupling these things, and then the target app, the API, receives the identity in whatever way it always expected to before. But the proxy can receive the identity from a more modern protocol. We could be adding OAuth to the proxy. The facade accepts the OAuth, consumes the OAuth, goes in. It's the relying party. It goes and it talks to the IDP, confirms that the token is correct. I don't want to crack open the application and rewrite all of that stuff into it. Instead, if I can put that at the proxy layer, that's a beautiful place to put it. Yeah, and then each application and identity provider can be migrated separately. That's great because, again, if I'm decoupling the identity, I'm decoupling whatever it is, I have less risk of a system-wide failure when I add a identity provider and we all had to test every single application on that Friday night, Saturday morning, and go through it. We can increment them, or we can migrate them incrementally and test each of them as we come through. So identity, obviously, with my background, identity is very important to me, something that I'll talk about quite a bit. Harden the identity. Well, I told you I'd talk about it quite a bit. So now we have this abstraction layer. We have the proxy. We have the facade sitting there, and we can layer in additional factors. One thing with traditional applications, like not just APIs, we often put in a step-up authentication or a second factor that goes into it. On the back channel as well, if you are talking directly from your facade to the application, to the API, this is a good time to add mutual TLS. And I touched briefly on continuous access evaluation protocol, risk sharing, these sorts of things, which are not even very well established right now in the industry, but are the up and coming best practices. You can put that into the new facade layer, again, without rewriting the application, without breaking the application or the API as it exists, enforce that at the facade and allow the traffic to go through appropriately and in ways that are secure for the existing application. Another thing, as long as I'm talking about access control, I like to talk about externalizing authorization. A lot of a lot of legacy or existing applications can or have been written to handle the authorization internally. It's not a best practice, and it's something that the industry is moving away from, something the ecosystem would say is not the best practice. So this is a good time to, as you're doing it and as you're making improvements to your software, to externalize the authorization. Either have the facade layer do the authorization itself. And let me just touch on the difference between authentication and authorization. Sometimes I just get so excited about auth-n for authentication and auth-z for authorization that I forget to talk about what is it that I mean here. So the authentication is who you are, and authorization is what you're allowed to do based on who you are. And those two things are very often separate. Like you could log in, and if you're not an administrator, there's certain things that you should not be allowed to do with the API. So for the authorization, this is a good point when we're moving to the facade. When we're decoupling, we can decouple authorization as well and go talk to third parties. We could be pulling it off of OAuth tokens as they come through, many different mechanisms by which we can do this. And this is also a great time for us to improve our general practices. Like now that we've taken this legacy software, now that we have decoupled some parts of this, let's get into continuous integration. Let's do some regression testing on it. Let's make sure that as we are adding this functionality, we can improve our practices that go into it as well. So what I have proposed there is kind of the abstract view of how to do this. Go in and add a proxy, go in and have a facade that communicates to the existing software, but externalizes a lot of the capabilities, a lot of the non-business related functionalities that you want in modern software. You can also just go and pay other people to do this. I'm sure a lot of people probably know the space better than I do around the different vendors. I've just put a few up there. Apigee and Amazon, obviously, very with that space. You have your entire cloud infrastructure sitting behind it. You could also go with companies like Tick, MuleSoft, Kong, very familiar to the people who work in API space. I'll also put out there very briefly, Strata Identity works in this space as well, where we are very into modernization of applications and APIs. So if you're interested in talking to us or any other company that's in this space, these are some of them that I would recommend. And that's it for me. That's all of the slides that I have. Happy to talk about questions or anything that you want, really.
Thank you so much, Topher, for all of that information.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, as you were going over the triggers of why people move into the space of modernizing their legacy applications, what do you find is the most common one that really pushes people and motivates people to get this done?
Well, the most motivating one is money, frankly. If you find that you're going to be suddenly paying a lot more for existing functionality, that is very, very motivating and something that's happening in the industry quite a bit right now. I think that the next after that is security. When you realize that the existing application is just not as secure as it should be, and there could be vulnerabilities, that's another good kick in the pants to invest and improve your functionality.
Also, as you were talking about, that sort of big bang cutover and what the impact of that could have, I was curious if you have any interesting war stories about, being interesting there.
I wouldn't say interesting, but maybe traumatizing. I think that a lot of people have gone through that process where they have been up all night. My company just has done this with some of our customers recently, where we are one small piece of an entire thing where they are rolling over dozens and dozens of applications. And these things go late into the night and people get grouchy. Something goes wrong. You have to make the call. Do we roll it back? Do we not roll it back? And on top of that, you also have to be so trepidatious for the coming days and weeks about, is there something that we missed when we did the cutover? Is there an insidious bug in there somewhere? Are people getting access to something that they shouldn't have access to? And we won't find out for some period of time. That's a tough week to be on call, tell you what.
Yes. And the incremental approach that you sort of recommended, how long do you think that usually takes? About what kind of timeline are people looking at when they take that incremental approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we find, and it's different for everybody, for what we find when we are working with, we have one large customer, they've got hundreds of such applications that they're migrating off of legacy software and starting to use our system in order to talk to their back end. What we find is the first one takes maybe a couple of days. When you get into it, really it's about the app owner learning how the system works. You're very, does this do what we think it's supposed to do? But then we find that we get into a spot where we can actually migrate individual applications within an hour or two. It's not that hard to do the migration of an individual application. It's the doing all of the applications, which is frightening.
Yes. Any parting words of wisdom?
No, I think that I've really had fun. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you guys.
Thank you for being here with us. And again, thank you for sharing all the information. I know that the slides will be shared afterwards with our attendees, but thank you again.